Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dawn of Drones podcast. I'm Dawn Zoldi, your host and the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting. So great to see you out there. Just remember, this is live, so don't forget to jump in the chat. Tell us where you're from, ask us questions, give us positive encouragement. We love all of that. Well, here we are in October, and what a month it's going to be. We are kicking off Defenders Month as a theme with two absolutely incredible guests. Charles Werner from DroneResponders and Chris Todd from the Airborne International Response Team. Before we jump into today's episode, I just want to go back and mention what an incredible month we had last month of September with Movers and Shakers. So sponsored by Delta Drone International and Parazero, we had all kinds of incredible folks. And so if you missed any of that, go back to DroneLife TV, watch all of our back episodes, and go ahead and subscribe to that channel as well. So let's go ahead and get started. And gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. It is so amazing to have you. And just for everybody out there, when you think of defenders, and I'm going to nerd out for a second here, being a college professor as well as a lawyer, and just say, when you think of our first line of defense in this country, it starts with the Constitution and the 10th Amendment. And those powers for the general welfare are reserved to the states. And folks like our firefighters and our first responders and our law enforcement are always our first line of defense. And the two gentlemen we have with us here today, they are at the tip of the spear when it comes to leading that community writ large, not just in this nation, but globally, in guiding them in advanced technologies with an emphasis on drones. So thank you both for being here and for what you're doing.
Thanks, Don. Great to be here.
Good to be here.
All right, so let's go ahead with some intros. Now, it's almost like you don't really need an introduction because so many you're everywhere and so many people know what you are. But let's talk a little about who you are, because even though people might have seen your name in association with your various organizations, they might not really deeply know your background. So let's start with that, and let's start with Charles.
Thanks, Dawn. So I started in public safety, and I've been involved for 47 years. I started at the age of 14, and we'll skip to 18 because that's when I became a career firefighter with the Charlottesville Fire Department for 37 years and held almost every position, firefighter, supervisor, communications officer, training officer, deputy fire chief, and the last 10 years as fire chief. And then after retirement, I went into the Department of Emergency Management in Virginia to serve as a senior advisor and mistakenly agreed to take on the responsibility of acting deputy state coordinator, which after 2 weeks, we ended up having 8 tornadoes in one day. And then a little bit later, a couple of months later, we had a 100,000 gallon fuel spill from Oceana Naval Air Station into Virginia Beach, and I was working 60-hour weeks. So that's part of that story. And then throughout my career, I was involved in technology things. I just kind of took on a technology, computers, thermal image cameras, David Clark, hearing protection, all different types of things, iPads, kind of became a technology editor for Firehouse Magazine, and just kind of stayed with that all throughout. And then I worked on at the local, state, and national levels with a number of different leadership roles throughout. So that was just one of those things that helped move things along when we were trying to think about drone responders. And then in my last 2 years as fire chief, I started exploring drones as a tool because that was one of those technology things and one of the next things that I saw, and started exploring all that, and it led me into starting drone responders. And there's a little bit more before that, but that kind of gives you a kind of a brief intro.
Well, what an incredible background. And my background is, I think both of you know, and many people out there, is with the military. And when you say you reached fire chief, for those not involved in that community directly, I mean, we're talking the equivalent of a general officer, basically. You were at the very top of the organization. And so 47 years dedicated to service, to public service. Thank you for that. That's just absolutely incredible. And Chris, I know you have an equally interesting story because you were on our clubhouse last week, and I learned a lot about you from that conversation, and I hope you'll share that with this crowd as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for having me here today on the podcast. So I'm going to give you the real abbreviated version of my origin story. I'm a 10th generation American. My family came here in the 1600s. My great-grandfather was one of the first aviators in the United States. He served as a second lieutenant back in 1917. He got his pilot's license. So the culture of aviation kind of dates back to my family, back to that era. My uncle flew Corsairs for the Marine Corps off the USS Kitty Hawk in the Pacific in World War II. So fast forward, how did I get involved in this? My background was really technology. I was working as a technology analyst in New York City, advising Fortune 500 companies, National Football League, Major League Baseball on content and how to use the internet. We saw the first .com bubble kind of rise and pop. After it popped, it was time for me to go find something else. So I actually left New York on September 1st, 2001. And as I got in the taxi, I remember waving goodbye to the Twin Towers saying, hey guys, we'll see you soon. 10 days later, we all know what happened. 9/11 came.
20 years ago, we just we just commemorated the 20th anniversary of that horrific event.
Yeah, and that really impacted, I think, all of our lives, and especially in public safety. We saw what happened there at Ground Zero. So, as a proud American, that was kind of placed in the back of my mind. I went overseas and I started working on some technology projects, but I came back to the U.S. and I started volunteering with the U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary, and I got really into it. And that's really like my background for emergency management. And for those who are familiar with the auxiliary, it's not the reserves. It's really, they're kind of known as the old guys who wear these orange life jackets and drive around yelling at other boaters. So I recruited a really cool group here in Miami. We try to make it cool. But that was my background in emergency management. Fast forward a couple more years, I'm working on a real estate project in Belize, looking over the shoulder of a videographer we hired who's flying a DJI Phantom 2. And I was blown away by the point of view I saw. And I realized very quickly that was going to change the way that public safety agencies and emergency services organizations use and gain access to aviation technology. So came back to Miami, formed Airborne Response as a for-profit company, and about a year later, we realized that there was a real need in the nonprofit space. You had Team Rubicon, kind of the boots on the ground, the infantry for disaster response. You've got the Cajun Navy, the boat forces for disaster response, but there wasn't an Air Force. So we formed the Airborne International Response Team, or AIRT, as a 501c3 nonprofit charity to serve as the Sky Force, so to speak, for disaster response, and we've been working on building that out ever since.
But that's just a great context to understand really how AIRT or AIRT fits into the bigger picture with the Cajun Navy, as you said, and Team Rubicon. I have a lot of colleagues from the military and really just during my, this drone career that are in both of those organizations, and of course now in yours as well. So helping with things as recent as Hurricane Ida, and and by the way, the Coast Guard, for people that don't know, I know Chris, you mentioned you're part of the auxiliary to them. Such an interesting organization because they're right now under Department of Homeland Security, and they both have law enforcement and military authorities. So super complex and interesting organization. I love that you got involved with the Coast Guard as part of the auxiliary. Super cool.
Yeah, a lot of people don't even realize that the Coast Guard has its own air branch too, called Auxiliary Air. In the Coast Guard Auxiliary, it's a lot like the Civil Air Patrol. So just a little nugget out there for future reference. We'll see if the auxiliary gets involved in drones. Well,
and fun fact, most people don't know the Air Force actually has a couple of boats. I won't tell you what they're for, but they actually do. So let's just say DC area, hypothetically speaking. So yeah, really, and all the services have some kind of like air component at this point, maybe even Space Force, although I haven't dug deeply into that. That's a new one. All right, so let's talk about AIRT and exactly what it is, Chris, first, and then we're going to talk about the link up between that and drone responders with Charles.
Sure. So again, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in Miami, designed to provide innovative airborne capabilities to help people prepare for, respond to, and recover from complex emergencies and disasters. It's been, very interesting building this out because it is a lot more complex than just putting people on a bus and sending them into a disaster zone and helping them clear rubble piles. I mean, we've got the complexities of airspace and the equipment and the liabilities involved and the rapidly changing technology. So one thing we found is there's just a lot of interest. There's a lot of interest from the drone sector in how can I help? How can I use my drone to go out if a tornado hits Kansas or a tsunami hits the Philippines or a hurricane hits Florida? How can I get involved and do something good with my drone? And so that's the piece of the puzzle that we're working on putting together. It's a little bit challenging because everybody wants to be involved, but we've really got to vet people who've got the right skills and the right experience and the right equipment and capabilities to really operate effectively within the emergency management role and within the National Incident Management System framework. So I know you know a little bit about that.
Yeah, the NIMS and the National Response Framework
Yeah.
and all the emergency support functions and annexes. But let's transition to Charles, because just hearing you, Chris, clearly training is going to be critical for that. Really having that understanding, like you said, of the airspace and the rules, because we've unfortunately seen people interfering in these critical operations with drones, right? And we don't want people to be doing that. So Charles, tell us about drone responders, kind of what your mission is, and how you are connected with AIRT.
So let me give you a little preview. Before drone responders, I had created, through the cooperation with a lot of different people around the country, the National Council on Public Safety, UAS, because we realized I was actually the chair of the National Fire Protection Association 2400 committee, which is UAS standards, the first chair. And there we all got together and said, we need to be doing something different. Everybody's trying to figure out how to do this. Everybody's starting from scratch. So we started the National Council, but it was a community of like minds. It wasn't an organization. It wasn't official. So we couldn't enter into agreements with other organizations or companies. When I was doing a presentation with Chris at one of the programs that AIRT put on, we had some side conversations, and we were friends before that. And I kind of expressed my frustrations of we can't seem to move forward because of not being an entity. And he said, well, I may have a solution for you. And he proposed that maybe drone responders be pulled in under AIRT as a program. So we did that. But the main thing that we do now is try to be a resource to those agencies that wish to start drone programs in public safety. And it's not just public safety. It can be public works or any public aircraft operations, really, because all the information is appropriate for all those. But we started to create a resource center that now has over 600 documents. So we have SOPs, training manuals, checklists, task books, so that everybody else doesn't have to start and do their learning from trial and error. And so now there's model SOPs out there you can find from the large cities, you can find from others. And then from that, we started developing working groups so that we can say, how can we discuss what's happening in the different areas? For example, the major cities working group, because they have very unique challenges, and that's populations over 500,000. We're starting up now Women in Public Safety US working group, so that women can be talking to each other and actually mentoring others and being some mentors in the school levels. See, we're looking at some STEM projects that we can combine public safety, STEM, and drone responders in with the school system, so that we can engage girls at a younger age so that they can understand the opportunities that exist. And then, thanks to Chris, we do research studies on public safety. So we ask the questions of what's happening out there. What do the budgets look like? How many people do you have as remote pilots, and all those kind of questions? What's your budget? And then we do monthly webinars with the FAA. So we have a conversation with the FAA, and Mike O'Shea comes on, and we give the latest updates from the FAA's perspective. And then we spend usually 90 minutes, 60 minutes of content, and 30 minutes of questions, and usually run from 45 to 60 questions that we answer directly live online. And then we work with NIST as far as the training goes, as far as open test lanes. We are an official auditor for NIST. And we also work with ASTM as far as the training stuff about the minimum requirements for public safety remote pilots, and we're an auditor for the ASTM standards. Some of the exciting things that we're doing now that's more exciting is the drone responders, drone directory, and map dashboard, which we put out in May, and we now have over 960 agencies from around the world that are putting their information in, and that includes over 22 countries that are participating. And then, like I said, we just went over 5,000 members for drone responders, and that includes participation from 54 countries, and that was not planned.
It's so hard to keep. I mean, geez, that was great. A long monologue with so much packed into there. You'd almost have to go rewind and go back and listen again to really catch everything you just said. But the scope of what you're doing is absolutely incredible. The impact. So remind me, Charles, to the membership you're talking about, this is free. Like, this isn't pay to play. All
Yes.
those resources you're talking about are publicly available primarily on your website, correct?
Mhm.
Can you tell everybody what your website is just so they know and they can go to that, make sure they sign up and become members?
Yeah, it's DroneResponders.org, and you can go in, you hit the join button, and it'll take you maybe 30 seconds to join, and then you have access to the resource center and the other information, podcasts, studies, and the other things that we've done. So you'll be able to find that as you go into the tabs of the menu. So it's pretty easy to navigate.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm a member, and I know I help you with the legal and policy stuff as one of your folks doing that. I do want to say we've got Rescue 911 saying hello from North Carolina. So thank you, Rescue 911, for joining us. Anybody out there, just jump in the chat. Let us know where you're from. If you've got any questions for these gentlemen, we'd love to engage with you guys directly. But I want to give a shout out to Charles, to the work you're doing with your new women's group. So kudos on that. You've already been deeply involved with Women in Drones and Sharon Rossmark, a group that I'm personally affiliated with as well. And I just think that's great. We used your. I want to talk for a second about, to you and Chris both, about your recent survey. Every year, I think last year might have been a pause because of COVID. You put out that public safety survey to get a baseline on kind of what's happening out there in the drone community and public safety. It's a great resource. We actually modeled, Sharon Rossmark, Marlene Deals from DDNC in Canada, and myself modeled our DEI survey for women in drones off of what you guys did, because we're also trying to build a baseline for diversity, equity, inclusion across the industry. And I say industry, I'm talking UAS and AAM as well, kind of full spectrum. And so we'll see how that goes. We got the results in, and more to follow there. But tell us about your survey, and maybe, you guys kind of divide and conquer here, because Chris hasn't talked in a little bit. What are the top 3 takeaways you'd say coming out of that survey?
This is the survey guy.
Okay,
All right,
survey
well,
guy, go ahead.
thanks, Charles. All right, I'll jump in on that. So my background as a market analyst in New York, kind of helped me figure out how to do a little bit of market research. So that's the foundation for what we wanted to do this. And Baird College had been doing a little bit of work over the last 5 years, trying to really build up a database of how many public safety drone programs were out there. And I think the methodology they were using was really predicated on media clippings and kind of pulling out information that may or may not be self-reported, may not be self-accurate. Baird College, I believe, has kind of ceased doing that. And so we saw a gap and a real need, and thought it made sense for drone responders to pick that up. So started in 2019, 2020, 2021 with the annual public safety UAS survey that we've had just great responses for. And it's really designed to have some control questions that allow us to slice and dice the data based on the size of the agency, the type of agency, their tenure, just a number of factors, and then really dig into key issues that we think are affecting the sector that given year. So for example, this year we focused heavily on live streaming. I know we focused on training and standardization in 2019, and it's really designed to kind of help us understand where the needs are within the public safety sector, as well as help some of the manufacturers and solution providers deliver products that are really going to meet the needs of public safety, and also provide a good benchmark for public safety agencies to kind of gauge where they are in the process. So some of the key takeaways we've seen this year, unsurprisingly, is most budgets still $10,000 or less. The vast majority, around 75% of public safety agencies, are operating on budgets of less than $20,000 per year. They're heavily reliant on grants and or donations at this point to fund their programs. Personnel are serving collateral duty still. Very rarely do we see programs where they have dedicated drone folks. So that means that their UAS pilot might also have a role on the SWAT team, or might have a role on a fire engine. And so if the SWAT team gets deployed, who's going to find the drone or who's going to operate the drone?
Right.
So fire's got to come out for that. So these are the kind of questions we're kind of digging into. There's so much information there that you'll probably start to see us release more data now that we've kind of got these conferences behind us. But it's very interesting to see, how this has been unfolding over the last 3 years.
Well, that's a great segue to Charles then, because you mentioned the word conferences. And when I said you guys are everywhere, I mean, you guys are everywhere. And, with your drone responders, verticals, and clearly the information you're getting from this survey is informing the kind of content you're putting out and how you're shaping that. Because, having done the military thing and appreciating extra duty and how when something else pops up, that takes a back seat. The importance of education and training is all the more to me important. And you've really filled that gap. I mean, Charles, we talked about in Clubhouse how you guys are going to be doing, your vertical at the Energy Drone and Robotics Coalition upcoming in Houston, Texas at the end of October. And I'm going to be there too. I'm moderating a BV loss panel for that. But, when I saw that, I was like scratching my head, like, what does drone responders have to do with energy? And then it, Sean Gear was on this podcast last month, and he answered the question. He said, well, anytime there's like a natural or man-made disaster, it's usually critical infrastructure and the energy sector that gets hit. And it's those first responders that come and have to help. And usually some of them are going to bring their drones. So, then it was the light bulb went off for me. I'm like, okay, this makes an abundant amount of sense. So tell us, kind of who else you're partnering with and what you've already done. And this is a 3-part question: who you're partnering with, what you've already done, and what you expect to see going forward in 22.
Let me talk about the all hazards first, and I'm going to flip over to Chris, because Chris really he's the mastermind behind the conferences. He's
Gotcha.
The guy who created the links. But if you think about it, from drone responders, in most cases, especially, and I'll use the fire service in general as one reference, the fire service responds to all hazards.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if it's a tornado, a fire, a flood, a shooting. Firefighters are at every event, and now we're seeing similar with the drone responses, whether it's a fire service drone operation or law enforcement or others. If they're the only ones flying, they're flying all the missions.
Yeah,
and so we're
makes
connected.
sense.
And so when you think about that, in a broader sense, it's not only public safety, but it's also public service, because we're tied into our public works departments, we're tied into our parks and recreation departments, and we all work together collectively to solve the issues. So all those are relative. And then I'm going to flip back over to Chris to talk about the conferences and how they kind of came to be.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. And Don, one thing I didn't cover is I'm also a certified emergency manager. So talking about that whole community, I mean, we're seeing evidence of that right now in Huntington Beach, California, with the oil spill on the ocean. I mean, is that just an energy issue, or does that affect public safety? There's a lot of different touch points. So that's kind of where, Sean's right and Chief's right. That's, it all kind of comes together. So the Energy Drone and Robotics Summit kind of stimulated or emulated out of the work we've done with AUVSI at Exponential, with Diversified Communications and Commercial UAV Expo, and our own conferences, which is, as Charles said earlier, is really kind of how we came together. But it's been a continuation and an acceleration of all this programming, where we're now realizing that the conversation needs to transcend beyond just public safety and really encompass the whole community of emergency management. And it's not just about the response, but it's also about managing air traffic and managing operations. Public safety needs to understand why does the energy company need to be flying drones after a hurricane? And the energy company needs to understand why public safety agencies need to be out there operating. And we all need to help manned aviators understand why we need to be out there. There's just a lot of work that needs to be done. And we're looking for these conferences to kind of help lead into those conversations.
As well as building a network.
Yeah, build a network, you are talking my language, you're speaking my language there, Chris, because I totally agree. People don't necessarily appreciate those connections, but they're so important. I mean, 90% plus of critical infrastructure in this country that is the lifeblood of America is owned by the private sector. So yes, of course, they're going to have their drones, or they're going to have their drone pilots that they hired to help them, in a response situation. And I love the idea that you're holistically now looking at emergency management. It makes a lot of sense. And I hope some of my students, if they're not watching now, that they will later, because you're talking exactly what we discuss in my Homeland Security class every week. So this is great stuff. And in fact, I have one student who said he's getting a drone, and so I'm going to tell him about you guys, and maybe you're going to inspire him to join your community.
That's awesome. And let me just say, you mentioned Sharon Rossmark and Women in Drones. Sharon's going to be here in Miami next month for the Advanced Air Mobility Conference. That's going to be happening in Doral. I'm going to be speaking at that too, and it's going to be interesting because that's really going to be our first foray into taking the conversation into the UAM AAM realm. As far as I mean, you think about the power of drones right now for emergency management, but it's going to just multiply as we start transporting cargo and people.
Look, absolutely. The Advanced Mobility Collective, Todd Spain was on here last month with Ben Miller, who I know is a great colleague and friend of yours, Charles.
Yep.
One of the first folks in the country to start a drone program for law enforcement here in Mesa County, Colorado, and now at our Center of Excellence for Advanced Technology Aerial Firefighting. These folks are working directly because when you think about mobility and logistics, it's going to be those larger drones and larger even passenger aircraft. Heck, it's what the Air Force is doing right now, right, with AFWERX and Agility Prime. They're working with Joby, not so Joby can be on demand like UAM provider out in the public, although that's part of it. It's so they can transport soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines on the battlefield without having a pilot, and maybe get them off the battlefield during that golden hour if they're wounded. So my good friend Peter Schmidt from Transcend Air, he's now deeply involved in that with his Vi aircraft. So for you guys to jump into that space makes a ton of sense, and I can't wait to see what happens with it. Let's talk a little bit about what else is going on. So I just saw you reinstituted your podcast. You have an incredible newsletter. Both of you do separately. And then you already mentioned your webinars, and then I think you said you also have a blog that you've kind of regenerated as well. So tell us a little bit else, like what am I missing here? Because you've told us so much, like what else is out there that people can expect to see from AIRT and drone responders?
Let me start first. I think one of the things in the resource center that's important people know. So if you were a public agency and you wanted to get a COA in the past, you had to go into the CAPS process, and it was a painful process to go through, especially if you have never had any exposure to it.
And so what's CAPS? That's an acronym.
That's for the COA application process.
Got you.
And the bottom line is people didn't know how to fill out some of those questions. There were certain places that everybody got stuck, and so we have Brandon Carr, who's with Pearline, Texas Police Department, who's on our team as well, helped with the map, helped to develop a COA guide, and he worked with Steve Pansky with the FAA so that they got it right. And Steve went through and made the notes of what were the pain points that they would see when people were going through the process. So there's a 55-page screen by screen capture how to go through and do the CAPS process. So it's going to expedite that. Some of the other things that are exciting is recently we got the tactical beyond visual line of sight waiver.
How could I forget that? That
allows
was so
us to fly
huge.
Yeah, and so that took a year to get there, but that was where we had to get the FAA and us kind of in that sweet spot of what we needed to have done, but making sure that we were doing safety, and that allows us to fly 1,500 feet beyond visual line of sight horizontally over buildings and around buildings within 50 feet of the building. So we're really in non-navigable airspace. And if we've got an aircraft flying in 50 feet above a building, we got a bigger problem than that drone. So now during an active shooter or hazmat situation where you really don't want to put the remote pilot or visual observer in harm's way, they're going to have to be beyond visual line of sight. So we were doing that, and we're looking now maybe trying to get that expanded a little bit as far as the distance. And then, as you know, Chula Vista has the Drone as a First Responder program, which is one of our bigger working groups right now that has over 100 members of agencies, vendors, industry, that are all interested in saying, how do we make this go forward from Chula Vista? So now we have Chula Vista that's doing Drone as a First Responder, Clovis, California PD is Drone as a First Responder, and Reno Fire Department as as first responders. So once we get this stuff together, we're putting a matrix together of what are the questions you need to answer when you go to the FAA to make your waiver request to become Drone as a First Responder, so that you've got kind of a list of things to work on to provide that information to the FAA. So
yeah, let's I want to talk about the drone as a first responder concept. So explain, first of all, let's back up. When you talked about the tactical BV loss, for those that are not familiar, I did an article on this for Inside Unmanned Systems magazine called, In Search of the Holy Grail, Beyond Visual Line of Sight. And I talked about this process, and you guys, I think, had just come out with the tactical BV loss approvals, something I pitch in that article. And I'm just going to say it here because you guys are now expanding to emergency management writ large. And, the private sector is in fact a part of that. Like, that should be expanded to legitimate companies that have a need, like these critical infrastructure companies and groups, so that they can also do this. So let's pivot for a second and talk then back about the drone as a first responder concept. This is the idea that when something bad happens, you hit the button, the drone goes first.
Well, basically, if we use Chula Vista as a model, basically when a dispatch comes in for certain types of identified calls, the drone is launched automatically and then navigated by telecommunicators. So they're sitting there, they're directing the aircraft. Most of it will fly to the location autonomously, but then they'll take over and can change the view that they're looking at. I think there are now over 8,000 flights in Chula Vista. And the experience they've had is, most importantly, it has helped to de-escalate many, many situations that gave them eyes on before arrival to better be able to deal with the situation at hand. So
and saves lives. I mean, clearly it's going to save lives there.
Yeah, they've already got documented cases of that. And then there's the situation that you're also able to see when units aren't needed. So your free investment is huge. Now, what we're working on now is the safety case and trying to find that this is the holy grail for that. Is what's that detect and avoid technology that we can put in place that's going to provide the ability, because right now they have to have 2 pilots on the roof that have to watch. And now if we can solve that problem with detect and avoid, they can take that off, and the return on investment becomes really huge, because that's the biggest expense right now.
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly, you mentioned the Reno Fire Department. So I just did a piece working with Iris Automation, who is doing the detect and avoid as part of the Beyond program with Reno for the whitewater rescue. And I learned so much talking, I think, to Chief out there. I feel like it's Dave Cochran, but I could be screwing up his name, so don't quote me on that. But I learned so much about, we think about that golden hour. It applies even more urgently on the water, especially in cold water temperatures where people's bodies start shutting down and they panic when they think no one's coming to find them. Just to have that drone above, like, so they see like, oh, somebody can see me, like, I think will actually, in just that in and of itself will save lives. So just
well, DOT put something out that said if you trim a certain number of minutes off of response, that you can save 10,000 lives per year.
Oh my
and I
gosh,
don't know what that number is, but now you're seeing, but you're getting more accurate. So if they see that the priority needs to be increased, the units get dispatched more quickly. And if it's not as necessary, they can reduce the same thing. And now the Chula Vista Fire is also part of that project. So they're flying fires, and they're seeing the fires before they get there. They're seeing if they need to call for additional resources in hazmat. So there's a lot of
and just
things.
Think, Charles, and I want to talk with Chris here in a second. Just think of, you put some advanced sensors on there. Now you can appreciate structural issues. Can we even go into that second floor, right? Like, who's in there if you have right? So this, I mean, just the applications are incredible. And that's what I want to talk to Chris a little bit about, because in Clubhouse, we talked about some really interesting use cases that you're seeing. I mistakenly thought that drones were being used in Miami when the building collapsed to find people, and you kind of set me straight on that. So let's talk about that one, and maybe some other like hazmat or some other really interesting, let's just say the top 3 interesting use cases that you're seeing that maybe not everybody knows about in public safety and public service.
Well, based on the survey data, the top 3 use cases we're seeing right now, number 1 is training and exercises. I mean, public safety agencies are still trying to perfect how they're using the equipment and tactically how it integrates with what's going on the ground with that response. Number 2, damage assessment is up there, and we saw that at Surfside. And let me restate Surfside for a second, because they were using drones, I think, in the first 8 to 12 hours to look and look for people. And then it kind of became evident that, okay, it's
a recovery mission, not a rescue.
although very interesting, they came back before they demoed the rest of the structure to look for. That was a really big issue because
Oh, wow.
there was a lot of concern about what pets might be lost, so they were using drones to look for pets.
Oh,
What we
wow.
did see there, very successful, was mapping to map the pile and document the changes in the pile. Homicide, when they would find a victim, oftentimes they couldn't get a handheld camera in there in some cases, so they'd fly the drone in to document the position and the area in the pile where the victim was found. And then NIST came in and started doing some amazing work to try to figure out why that building collapsed. And so, it's going to be a while till we get their data, but they were using total stations, LiDAR, photogrammetry, and just a wide variety of payload sensors. So I think damage assessment is right up there. We're seeing search and rescue is starting to evolve. It's really tough, though, for a pilot, especially during the day, to operate the aircraft safely and monitor the screen and look for a victim or a target, depending on what the terrain is, the size of the search object. If it's a car, a little bit easier. But right, I mean, we've got teams out there in the swamp looking for this guy Brian Laundrie, and nobody can find
from
anything.
yep.
Yeah, so I think that's where AI and machine learning is really going to come into play to be able to do instantaneous change detection and look for anomalies. I know Gene Robinson historically has said that if you can find the color blue during a search pattern, you're in pretty good shape because somewhere north of 70% of all missing victims are wearing blue jeans. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, to be able to build that type of methodology into the technology is going to help the pilots. And as we go to autonomous technology and drone swarms, you can kind of see how this is all going to fit together. It's going to get really, really exciting and really cool.
And what I think is going to be really cool when you think about future trends, right, is this idea not only of human-machine pairing, but human-machine-machine pairing, because I know, for example, Asalon is already working with Boston Dynamics with Spot, and they have, the dog and the drone like working together, right, in situations. So I think we're going to
IoT.
just see, yep,
Yeah, it's all
more
about
and more.
network systems. And that's what we're seeing with drone as a first responder, right? It's like it's great that the drone goes there, but if you can't push the video feed where it needs to be and you can't get the information to the responding units, it's great. You've got a drone up there, but what's the purpose? So it's really about making sure that the information and actionable intelligence is getting out into the field of the hands of the people who need it in a timely manner. And I think that's
the
where
decision
we're seeing
makers and
yeah.
the analysis of that on the back end. So I mean, all these things we're talking about, like in my brain, it's just exploding of the future workforce and all the different career fields. When you just say the word drone, even drone in the public's in the context of emergency management, all the different branches and sequels and the kinds of people. In fact, Chris, when you were talking about the mapping and possible crime scene, I'm thinking this is exactly why lawyers need training in this technology. And I'm one of the few. There's a handful. I'm actually friends with them that are experts in this, but not a lot. And frankly, not a lot of trial lawyers. And this is evidence that could be admitted into court, and just understanding it and be able to authenticate it, so important. So that's kind of hopefully 2022. You'll see some new things from me on that. But that's part of the reason why I created my company, right? P3 Tech.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Quick comment on that. I mean, we're seeing attorneys respond to the incidents now, hiring private Part 107 pilots to try to map and photograph the incident. We saw it at the FIU pedestrian bridge collapse here in Miami, where they were trying to get aerial footage. We saw it at Surfside, which is, they were requesting special permission from the families to fly in within the TFR. So the attorneys are catching on that there's value on their side too to get whatever they can to try to document these types of large scale incidents where there could be liability involved for a.
And the insurance companies already have caught on, right? State
Yeah.
Farm was one of the first out of the gate with the IPP. So this is just going to continue to using AUVSIs where exponentially grow. There's no doubt. Go ahead, Charles. Looks like you wanted to add something.
Well, you said something about the future, and I think that as we get this beyond visual line of sight figured out, and I'm also participate on the BVLOS ARC. Chris and I are on the BVLOS ARC, which is kind of an interesting discussion. But as we get that resolved, here's an example of what I see is one, drones in the air constantly for immediate dispatch or to a certain situation. But imagine this, that if you have a really bad wildfire season, that you've got a drone that's loitering in different areas and automatically detects the earliest stage of the beginning of a wildfire, that
Yep.
alerts back to a system that automatically launches a self-extinguishing drone that flies to the location and hit that fire very quickly in some areas
Yep.
more remote than firefighters could ever get to. So,
Absolutely.
so we're seeing all those things, and the same thing with the flying in the air and having a shot spotter give an indication that shots have been fired in a certain area, and within seconds, a drone is taking video footage live, feeding it back to dispatch and to law enforcement. And then
Yeah.
one of the things we didn't talk about was flying drones indoors, and what it's
Yep.
meaning for law enforcement these days, because they're able to fly into these very dangerous situations for room checks and not have to put their people in harm's way. And there's a great example in Atlanta where they fly into, I think it's either an apartment or a hotel, for a murder suspect, and the murder suspect sees the drone inside the building and immediately puts his hands on his head and walks out and gives up. So
Wow.
that's just kind of the amazing changes we're starting to see already.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brink drones inspired exactly by what you said, Charles, and that horrific, shooting that we saw in Las Vegas, and this idea, like, how can SWAT teams, how can, law enforcement use these drones to more effectively bring down suspects, find them, outdoors, indoors, all of it. So great stuff. Absolutely. Well, we are. I mean, I could speak with you both like for days, and this is so fun, and I had a ton of fun in Clubhouse too. So we'll get you guys on this podcast again for sure in 22, and we're definitely going to stay in touch. I look forward to seeing you both live in Houston, or at least one. I'm not sure who's coming, but looking forward to that. I'm going to be repping women in drones there in addition to my own company, so that'll be a lot of fun with Maggie Schuster. So let's just say, how about 30-second kind of elevator speech closer for each of you, and we'll start with you, Chris.
All right. Well, again, thank you for having us on this version of the podcast. Great things have been happening both with AIRT and drone responders. It's been a pleasure working with Charles Werner. We do have other people involved, so I just want to give a shout out to our team at AIRT and drone responders and the work they're doing. If you're interested in volunteering, please come and get involved, AIRT.ngo or droneresponders.org. And if you're looking to register your public safety UAS program, teams.droneresponders.org. As you mentioned, we are relaunching the podcast. We took a little bit of a hiatus, but look for a new episode of Taming Disaster coming out next month. And other than that, I just want to say thank you. I think it's great to see you and DroneLife teaming up on this. I know Miriam's been such a great supporter of ours. So, wish you all the best and would love to come back next year when the time's right.
Thank you so much. And you're right, DroneLife has been a huge supporter, and we really appreciate them basically presenting this podcast to their crowd. And hopefully we'll get more folks with you. Charles, go ahead. You got your 30 seconds here.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for being on our board of advisors for drone responders and serving as our legal policy lead in those areas. I know we're looking to probably doing some more work with National League of Cities and some other locations, which we're having discussions. But thanks for your leadership in this, because you've really been out there on the forefront and you're setting a great example for women. And we want to support that as well. As Chris mentioned, we're here to help advance public safety UAS programs. One of the things we didn't mention is we also cover counter UAS and UTM. So that information is still on our website in the Resource Center as well, because we have to know how those three legs of the stool are working out, because if you don't have all three of them, you can't sit very comfortably. But what we do is we take a lot of questions, and the other thing that we do is we link people up to mentor them with other departments so that they're similar to themselves, so they can actually walk through the process with someone holding their hand if it's needed. But with that, I'd just like to say we're open to anybody from government, academia, industry, business. Membership is free, and we encourage anybody and everybody to join.
I love it. I have to tell you, when we were in Las Vegas, Chris was there, but I walked by the coffee place and there was a whole group of law enforcement from Boulder, Colorado. And I went up to them and I'm like, hey, everybody, like, nice. I'm from Colorado. They looked at me like I had 5 heads. It was so funny. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm I'm plugged in with drone responders. I love those guys. I'm so glad to see you guys here. So no, you guys are doing great things. And that there was probably about, I don't know, I didn't count them, but at least eight of them, maybe 10, giant contingent from Boulder, Colorado. So again, that's just one example of a group that you're inspiring, and you're doing it globally. So again, thank you both for everything you're doing. We are out of time. What I want to say real quick before we close, two things. Number one, this week we're moving our clubhouse to Friday. We're going to actually have Northrop Grumman on, a guy named Rob Menti, who's a colonel retired United States Army. And you mentioned counter UAS, Charles. That's what he's actually out there right now testing some systems. And he's going to be talking to us on this Friday in our clubhouse as part of Defenders Month. And I'm pretty sure he's going to join us on the podcast next Wednesday, same time, same. Actually, we're going to adjust the time a little bit because we're going to be live in North Dakota from the UAS Summit and Expo. And I'm so excited. I'm nerding out here because Brigadier General retired Andy Armacost, who was the dean at the Air Force Academy, I was his legal advisor. He is now the president of University of North Dakota, and he is going to be our guest next week live from that event. So join us next week. Thanks everybody for dialing in. This was a great session. Thank you both for being here, for everything you do. Out here.